to show you how to snag the pattern from your tee, okay? So to snag the pattern from your tee, get your t-shirt. And if you've got a new tee, you're not gonna run into this problem. If you have an old tee, you probably will. So, and the problem I'm talking about is the seams. You can see the side seam here is starting to wrap to the front, and this one's starting to wrap to the back. Completely normal over time. That just kind of happens as we wash clothing because it's usually a little bit off grain when they cut it. So to get the shirt to lay flat, because that's the key thing when we're transferring the pattern, is to make sure that we shake those out. So grab at the underarm right here, just shake it out. Most of the time, the side seams are pretty straight. If they have a slight curve, you'll see the slight curve even if the seams are wrapping. So it's totally fine if they're wrapping, but we want to make sure that the shirt is laying as flat as possible when we start. So this part's nice and flat. And then work your way up. And start massaging the shoulders. And you're gonna find, see like this shoulder seam's coming a little bit forward, this one's going a little bit to the back. Same thing, it's just, this is an old shirt, it's been washed a ridiculous number of times. So just work at it until it lays nice. And once you have it laying as nice and smooth as possible, you're gonna step back and look at it and decide which side of the shirt looks the prettiest, okay? So if on one side the shoulder's just completely wonky and the other side the shoulder isn't, then go with the side that's less wonky, and we're just gonna transfer half the shirt. We're not gonna do the whole thing, just half of it, okay? And that'll make sense why we do that in a second, okay? This one, because it wraps so far to the back, I'm gonna ignore this side, and this one, the seam kind of sits right there. I like that. So some of your shoulder seams may come forward, totally fine, but just make sure that it's as centered as possible. Okay. And then find the side that you like. And at the bottom, figure out where the middle is. So here's my middle. I know that that's my middle up there. And then I'm just gonna start saying, I know that this right here is perfectly straight. If yours swoops, then actually just do a little dotted line, kind of showing where the swoop is. Along the side seam, if you know your side seam is straight, then you can just make a mark down here and a mark up here, and you can fill it in straight later. If there's a slight curve, like mine has a slight curve to it, I'm gonna come in and just give myself a dashed line. You don't have to draw the whole thing. We're gonna come in and perfect it later. Notice the sleeve is not laying flat. That's fine. We're gonna snag the sleeve pattern later. The area, only make sure that the area that you're transferring is perfectly flat. Everything else after that we can work out later. Anytime you come to like here on the bottom, make sure you give yourself two marks. One mark going one direction, showing that way, and another mark going the other direction to show that direction. So at the sleeve, I've got a mark showing where the side is going, but I've also got a mark showing where the sleeve hole is opening up, that armhole is opening up. My shoulder is going to be perfectly straight, and then I'm going to mark the seam line of the collar, not the collar all the way out here, just the seam line, because we'll get that later, okay? Now, all of this interior information, you've been waiting all semester to use it. Now's the time when we really like to use this tool right here. I'm gonna come in and just push nice and firm so that it goes through all the layers of the fabric and snag the front. If you feel right here, you can feel the back armhole as well. It might be exactly the same as the front. If it's exactly the same as the front, don't worry about transferring it twice. If it's slightly different, which mine is, then I'm going to feel where it's at and transfer that as well. I'm also going to transfer my neckline, but I'm not doing the edge of the collar, I'm doing the seam line of the front, and I'm also doing the back. You'll usually have a little like 1/4 inch strap right there, a little strip. Go right dead center. And it should match up at the exact same corner as the front one. That little point right there, both of them should match up right there. That's it. That's all I need to transfer the front, okay? And the back, actually, because I've got the front and the back information all right here. So I can move my shirt, and I can come in and I can start making some other lines. So I know where my middle is. So I'm gonna draw my center front and, which is actually also my center back. If you're using the other side of the paper because you don't want to use the grid, totally fine. Just make sure that this center front right here squares over. In my case, I've got a grid, so it doesn't particularly matter if I use the square or not, but if you don't have the grid, make sure you use your square to make sure that this is 90 degrees, unless there's a slope. If there's a slope, then just make sure that at least for a couple inches this is 90 degrees, and at least for a couple inches this is 90 degrees, even if there's a curve between the two of them. For the side seam, either use your very form curve, this guy, or use your side, your hip curve, and just lay it in there. And if, as you lay it down, some of the dots don't perfectly match up, like they vary here and there by like an 1/8 of an inch or even a 1/16 or whatever it happened to be, that's totally fine, because my shirt's been washed a ton. It can be, I can guarantee that it's not perfect anymore. So we kind of have to make a guesstimation and sort of figure out, how do I make this as perfect as it was when I first purchased it? So you can see this one right here, this dot and this curve match up nicely, but this one's off by a 1/16, so I'm just going to ignore it. Your shoulders should be straight. Your front and back neckline, it should be 90 degrees for at least a 1/4 of an inch. If not, you'll end up with a slight V-neck, or it'll kind of plank up. I'm going to use my French curve. I like that curve. If the curve doesn't fit perfectly, it's okay for you to ignore it and for you to go with a different curve. So other curves you have are this one. There's a metal French curve actually that's a little bit different. Usually if I'm rubbing off a pattern for a client or something like that, I can usually tell which curve was used by whatever pattern maker, whether it would be a metal one or not. In this case, I actually don't like this front neckline on any of the curves, so I'm going to draw it by hand. Just make sure if you choose to draw it by hand, it's really, really nice and smooth. Okay? Pause for just a second.